sleep technique in PSLE science, how to answer experiment questions. Okay, so what exactly is experiment question? Okay, I'm going to address very shortly. My name is Mr. Yang Iskandar, principal of Edufront Learning Center. Okay, so what are experiment type questions? Now, experiment type questions is quite common in PSLE, and it can carry up to 30% of the entire paper. And it can appear in both MCQ as well as the open-ended question. So you can see 30% is quite a large percentage of the entire paper. Okay, so that is why to be able to answer experiment type question effectively is very important. It's a very important skill. Experiment type questions may require students to identify aim of an experiment, formulate questions or hypotheses, devise fair methods, and carry out those methods to find out answers to the questions or to verify the hypothesis. Okay. So to score in the complex experiment and investigation question, you must be proficient in multiple processes, such as number one, formulating hypothesis. So you must know what is hypothesis, what's the meaning of hypothesis. You must be able to predict based on the data given to you, based on the information given to you, you must be able to predict what is going to happen in the experiment. You must be very observant, okay, your observing skills, comparing skill, you must be able to infer effectively, you must have the ability to analyze and evaluate the experiment. Okay, so experiment and investigation type questions can appear in all topics. It can any topics from P3 to P6 topics, but usually it appears in the physical sciences topics such as heat, light, electricity, and forces. Okay. Now, I'll give you some examples of experiment type question in the PSLE. Okay, I'll show you what I mean by experiment type question. Okay, this is taken from last year's PSLE, and this appears in the multiple choice question. All right. So Devi conducted an experiment on photosynthesis in a dark room using the setup below. So one keyword here, setup. Experiment question, there are setups. All right. So sometimes there is one setup, two setup, three setups. Okay. So she measured the amount of gases collected in the measuring cylinder after some time. So you can see here the setup, the lamp, ruler, tracing paper that allows sunlight to pass through. This is the the gas collected here, and we have ruler. Okay, and then there is a way of presenting data. Basically, there are two common ways. Number one is using tables, but in this question, they are presenting the result of the experiment using graphs. Okay, so you can see here, Devi repeated the experiment by increasing variable x. Now, what exactly is variable x? Okay, later on we'll find out. Okay, and keeping all other variables constant. So keyword here, this is the constant, and variable x here is the change variable. All right. So you can see here the data collected. The vertical axis is the amount of gas collected, and the horizontal axis is the variable x. All right. And the question asks, what could variable x be? Okay, anyone can guess? Or anyone wants to try? What do you think is variable x here? Jovan, would you like to try? Yes, Jolene or anyone? Light intensity, bubble. Okay, amount of bubble. Okay, amount of bubble. It will not be amount of bubble because the amount of gas collected here is in the vertical axis. Good try. Distance of the tracing paper. Okay, good. Possible. Okay, distance of the tracing paper. All right. Okay, so we will discuss this later on. All right. So I'm showing you here example of experiment question. Okay, this one example of experiment question. Okay, so next another example. Okay, this is another type of experiment question. under the topic of friction or forces. So Ming Hao conducted an experiment using the setup below. This is a past PSLE question. They conducted an experiment using the setup below. So you can see here, fixed wall, spring fully compressed, and there's a table here, right? So he measured the distance the block moved after releasing the spring. He repeated the experiment. Okay, repeated the experiment using blocks made of same materials but with various mass and area of contact with the table. Okay, so you can see here, this is the table. Okay, this is the table where they present the data. All right, so this is another kind of experiment question. Okay, where they have an experiment set up and then they have a table to present the result of the experiment. Okay, all right, so this is a past PSLE question. Okay, another past PSLE question on experiment. Rita wanted to study the effects of some materials, okay, the effects of some materials on the loudness of sound. All right, so you can see here, this is the change variable. Okay, later I'll tell you more about change variable. What is change variable? So she set up an experiment as shown below. She covered the open side of a soundproof box with material P. Okay, so you can see the experiment here. And the clock was set to ring at certain loudness. So she recorded the loudness of the clock with a sound sensor placed at a fixed distance. So your distance is fixed. She repeated the experiment using materials Q and R of the same thickness as material P. Okay, so you see here, keyword here, the materials are of the same thickness, right? And they present the data in a table form. All right. Okay, so this is another example. Okay, one more example of experiment question. Again, past PSLE question. Zainal wanted to investigate which material was best at reflecting light. He set up his experiment in dark room as shown below. Zainal shone the light from the torch into material P and walked towards it. When he could clearly see the material, he stopped and measured the distance x between the torch and the wall. So he repeated the experiment with materials Q, R, S each time, and the results are shown below. Okay, so you see here, the results are collected and presented in the table form. Okay. Yes, this is a past PSLE question. Some of you may have seen this question, or your teachers may have given you as a practice in school. All right, so this is under the topic of light. Light you have learned in primary 4, but in PSLE, please remember they can ask you any questions from primary 3 topics to primary 6 topics. But of course, the level or difficulty of questions at P6 or at PSLE will be very, very much more difficult as compared to when you were in primary 3 or primary 4. Okay. All right. So I've shown you 4 examples of experiment type question. So before we proceed on, okay, to show you the steps of how to answer experiment question, we need to identify or we need to know important keywords in experiment type question. Okay, so please take note. This is very important. All right. Number 1, aim of experiment. Okay, aim of experiment, you must know in any experiment there must be an aim or objective. A scientist will not do any experiment without aim or without the objective. So what is aim of experiment? It's a statement that describes the objective of doing the experiment or the purpose of doing the experiment. It usually starts with to find out, to investigate, okay? To find out, to investigate. Now, in some questions though, the aim of the experiment may not be very clear, okay? It may not be clearly stated in the question, so you must be very critical in your thinking and identify what's the aim of the experiment. Okay, later I teach you a trick, okay, how to identify the aim of the experiment in questions where they didn't show you or didn't state very clearly the aim of the experiment. Okay. Now, next is hypothesis. Now, what is hypothesis? Hypothesis is a tentative prediction for a scientific problem that can be tested for further investigation, right? So it is a tentative prediction. When you want to do, or when a scientist wants to carry out an experiment, they will state a hypothesis, meaning that what is the purpose of doing the certain experiment? Not the purpose. What is the the prediction? What is going to happen in the experiment? Okay. So that is the hypothesis. Okay, next, D. D stands for data here. So data are facts and observation collected from an experiment for further analysis. Okay, so when we do an experiment, you need to collect data. All right, for example, let's say in a race, you want to find out who is the fastest runner. So what we do is that we use a stopwatch and we time the timing of each participant. Okay, so we use a stopwatch as a method of collecting data. Likewise, in experiment in science, you can see different ways of collecting data. Okay, one example just now you see is by using the data logger or sound sensor. These are some ways to collect data. You can collect data also through observation. All right, like for example, you want to observe how many bubbles are given out during photosynthesis. All right, so these are the data that is being collected. So in experiment, there are data. Okay. Next, very important. Change variable. Okay, change variable is very, very important. So I want you to listen very, very carefully. So change variable are variables which are changed or manipulated by the scientists in the experiment. Okay, also known as the test variable, or the independent variable. Okay. Now, in an experiment, there can only be one change variable in an experiment. Otherwise, it would not be a fair test. Okay, there can only be one change variable in an experiment. Otherwise, it would not be a fair test. Okay, later we will go through some examples and I will elaborate more about change variable. All right, so change variable, very important. In any experiment, you have to identify what is the change variable, also known as the test variable. And usually, or almost all the time, the change variable would be stated in the aim of the experiment. Okay, so this is the clue. To identify or to know what is aim of the experiment, you need to identify or find out what is the change variable. Now, in an experiment, there cannot be more than one change variable, otherwise it would not be a fair test. Now, sometimes there could be more than one change variable. Okay, I've seen certain questions, there could be more than one change variable, and then the question went on to ask you, they will ask the students, is this a fair test? And if it's not a fair test, why this is not a fair test? What can you do to make this a fair test? All right. So remember this, change variable. It is also known as a test variable. There can only be one change variable. Okay. Next, fixed variable. Okay, fixed variable. Fixed variable also known as the constant variable. So other than the change variable, everything else must be the same, or everything else must be fixed or constant. Okay, so these are variables which remains the same in experiment, also known as the constant variable. Okay, also known as the constant variable. Next, result of the experiment. In an experiment, you want to collect data. There must be result. Okay, if not, it's not an experiment. So result of the experiment are data collected from the experiment, usually presented in table or graphical form, either in tabular form or graphical form. Now, graphs, there are different kind of graphs. Okay, I will do another session perhaps on how to analyze the different types of graphs. So basically, in science, very common graphs are, line graphs, bar graphs, and sometimes pie chart or pie graph. So result of the experiment is also known as the dependent variable. Why is it called dependent variable? Because the result is dependent on the change variable. Okay, so this is result of the experiment. All right, next, an important setup and in an experiment designed to minimize the effects of variables other than the change or independent variable. Anyone knows this? What is the answer here? What is the key term here? An important setup in experiment designed to minimize the effects of variables other than the change variable. Control, very good, Taufik. Okay, it's a control variable. Right? Now, control variable, okay, it is quite a complex term. So basically, in a control setup or a control, it is created so that you are able to compare and confirm that the result of the change variable, okay, or the result of the experiment is due to the change variable. Okay, so a control is a setup where it is used to compare and confirm that the result of the experiment is only due to the change variable. Okay, so as and when we see any question involving control, we will discuss this further. It's quite a complex concept. Right? Fair test. Fair test is very important. Okay, fair test is very important. In an experiment, it must be a fair test. If you're not a fair test, you are not able to use the result. Okay, so what is a fair test? Changing only one variable at a time. Okay, changing only one variable at a time while keeping all the other variables the same. Right? Keeping all the other variables the same. Meaning there can only be one change variable and everything else must be fixed or must be constant. So conducting a fair test is one of the most important criteria of a good scientific experiment. The other one is reliable test. Now, many students they often mix up between fair test and reliable test. Okay, so reliable test is where you repeat the science experiment to verify the results are consistent and not by accident. What I mean by accident, either due to human error or due to faulty equipment. Okay, for example, I just give you a simple example. Let's say a student scored full marks for one test. Now, can we say that this student is a super intelligent, very good student? Now, how do we confirm that that student is a very good student or proficient in the subject? What we do is that we give him another test. Okay, he sit for another test. So if every single test he gets full marks. So we can conclude that his test scores are reliable. Okay, but if only one test he scored full marks and then other tests he just passed, so that means that the result for that full marks is not reliable. So in science, very important that the result of the experiment is reliable so that we can use the result with confidence that this result is due to the rigor of the experiment that we conduct, and we can, make a conclusion from the data given. Right? Sehan, what if the test is for kindergarten? Okay. Now, 5-step thinking process. Now, this is very important. I want you to take note. Okay, can all of you write down this 5-step on a piece of paper? Okay, write down this 5-step. So when you see experiment question, just now I've already told you how to identify experiment question. So when you see any experiment question, these 5 steps should be in your mind. Okay, it should be in your mind. Number 1, identify the aim of the experiment. What is the aim? Now, sometimes the aim of the experiment is clearly given to you. Now, sometimes you need to infer the aim of the experiment. How to infer? Like I mentioned just now, you will need to identify what is the change variable or what is the test variable. Then from there, you will be able to have a clue of what is the aim of the experiment. So very important. If many students do not know how to identify the aim, okay, if you identify the wrong aim, then you will not be able to answer the experiment questions. Okay. Fazlun, very good. I screenshot, then I later write also can. Okay. So the reason why I ask you to write so that I want you to be thinking, okay, not just passive listening. I want you to be thinking and participating in this webinar. I know I cannot see you, all right? So, but I hope that all of you are, are listening very attentively. Okay. So step number 2, identify the constant variable and change variable. Okay, identify what is the constant variable and what are the change variable. So step number 3, identify, analyze the results. Remember I told you the result of the experiment, it could be number 1 in a table form, or number 2, it could be in graphical form. Graphs, that is another story. Not easy to identify graph or to understand graphs. This one I need another webinar session. to teach you how to interpret graphs, how to draw graphs, because graphs is not that easy for many students. Okay. Now, step number 4, once you do step 1, 2, and 3, the step number 4, very important, you must be able to identify the key science concepts. All right, so you must link back to the syllabus here. All right, you must link back to the syllabus and identify, hey, what topic are they testing me in this experiment? What is the topic? What is the science concept? So very important. So that's why I say in my last lesson, the science concept, it must be at your fingertips. Okay, some student was asking me in the last lesson how to remember so many science concepts. One way is to do a mind map, right? To read, draw a mind map until the science concepts are at your fingertips. You got no choice, but you still have time, not to worry. Okay, PSLE is still a few months away, so you still have time to remember and learn your the P3, P4, P5, and P6 science concept. So step number 5, once you identify the key science concept, you must be able to explain, okay? Must be able to explain the link between the science concept to the question or to the context. You cannot just take the science concepts and then dealing with the question that they ask you. Okay, you must always link back the science concept, the data that is being collected, aim of the experiment, and link back to the question. Okay. All right. Very good. Okay. Next, So what I'm going to do next is that I'm going to we are going to together work out or answer some experiment questions. Okay, work out some experiment question using this 5-step thinking process, and then you have a better idea of how to apply these 5 steps. Okay. All right. Now, can all of you see this? Just now was the question, one of the question there. Okay, so this is the 5 steps. Step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, step 5. All right, let's take a look at this question. Zainal wanted to investigate which material was best at reflecting light. He set up his experiment in a dark room as shown below. Zainal shone the light from the torch onto material P and walked towards it. When he could clearly see the material, he stopped and measured the distance x between the torch and the wall. He repeated the experiment with material Q, R, and S each time. His results are shown below. Okay, so you can see here in this experiment question, this is a past PSLE question. They present the answers or the data in a table form. Okay. Now let's take a look. Question number 1, step number 1. Okay, so I'm applying the 5-step strategy just now. Step number 1, what is the aim of the experiment? Okay, so aim of the experiment, you can see here in the first sentence, it is given quite clearly here. Okay, the aim of the experiment, okay, to investigate which material was best at reflecting light. Okay, so you can see here which material. Right, so this is the change variable and it is right on top here. So very clearly it's given, and you can see in the table also there are 3 materials: material P, material 4 variables: material Q, materials R, and material S. So basically they are testing 4 different materials: materials P, Q, R, and S. Oh, zoom out. You can see. Right. So step number 2, identify the constant variable and the change variable. Now let's identify the change variable first. Now change variable is very important. So what is the change variable? Anyone knows? You can see. So what is the change variable here? Okay, Taufik say material, everybody say material. Actually, it's not precise. If you just say material, it's wrong. Very good. Atika says type of material. Dania, very good. Because if you just say material, what aspect of the material? Are you talking about the color of the material, the thickness of the material, okay, the weight of the material, the mass of the material, what? All right. So to be more specific, the change variable is type of material. Okay. Now, what is the constant variable or the fixed variable? So everything else must remain the same. So number 1, Fixed variable, the amount of light given out by the torch. So this must be constant. Okay, the torch must be constant. You cannot use, in one experiment, you use a torchlight with very dim light. The other experiment, you use a torchlight with very bright light. So it will not be a fair test. So the amount of light given out by the torch must be the same, must be constant. Next, height of the material and torch from the ground. Okay, the height must also be constant. Material P, the height from the wall to the ground. Likewise, the torch from the distance from his hand here to the ground, it must be fixed, or it must be the same. Now, what is the dependent variable? A dependent variable is the variable where you collect the data. What data is being collected here? Okay, what data is being collected here? You can see here it is distance x. It is given here in centimeters. So for material P, distance x is 290. Material Q, distance x is 330, which is further. Material R, 300, and material S is 310. Right? So step number 3, identify and analyze the result. So again, we take a look at the table. From the table, we can say that x is the greatest. X is the dependent variable here. X is the greatest with material. Material what? Anyone can tell me? X is the greatest with material Q. Excellent. What about the lowest? X is lowest with material material P. Very good. Okay, so you all are listening. I'm very, very happy. Okay. Next, step number 4. Once you identify or analyze the result, next you need to identify the key science concept. So you need to recall what topic is being tested here. You see, even though PSLE, not necessarily they test only P6 topics. So they may be testing you P3 topics, P4, P5, P6 topic. So here you can see that the topic is on the topic of light, which you all learned in primary 4. So number 1, the key science concept, light can be reflected. Very good. Amount of reflection depends on the type of material. Very good, which the light was reflected on. So the next step, number 5, explain the link between the key science concepts, okay, to the question. So Q is greatest. Is the greatest what? Anyone? Reflector. Sure, very good. Reflector of light, as it is able to reflect light to the furthest distance. Excellent. Okay. So you can see here, past PSLE question on experiment. Just follow these 5 steps. This is the thinking process. When you see an experiment question, I don't expect you to write down all the information here, but it must go through your mind. That's why I'm telling some parents or students that this is a heuristic process or steps, step by step, where any experiment question, when you see, you have to go through these 5 steps in your mind. Okay, so it should come naturally. When you see an experiment question, number 1, what is the aim? Straight away you identify. Do not waste time. Some many students, they tell me that they are not able to read everything, or they don't read the question. So why you don't read? Because you do not know what to look up for. That's a problem. Okay, so when you see an experiment question, straight away identify where's the aim of the experiment. Number 2, what is the change variable, or what is the constant variable, and what is the dependent variable. Step number 3, where is the result of the experiment? How are they presented? Some are presented in the form of table. Some is presented in the form of graphs. Okay, so you must be able to analyze the table or analyze the graph. Step number 4, go back to the steps, the concepts. What is the key science concept that they're testing here? Because remember, when you're answering science question, you are not answering like a comprehension, English comprehension question. They want you to be able to write or be able to demonstrate your understanding of the scientific concepts. So remember, this is a science paper, not an English paper. So you must be able to show scientific concepts. Always remember that. Many students, they lose marks because they miss out the keywords, which is very important to clarify the scientific concept. And number 5, you must be able to explain the link between the key science concepts to the question. Always go back to the question. What is the question asking? And then link the concepts back to the question. Okay? All right, one more last question. One more last example. Another example. Okay, this is a past PSLE question. Rita wanted to study the effect of some materials on the loudness of sound. So you can see here, straight away, I know that this is the change variable and the aim of the experiment, okay, on the loudness of the sound. She set up an experiment as shown below. She covered the open side of the soundproof box with material P. So you can see here, there are 3 materials. So the clock was set to ring at certain loudness. So you can see the loudness is actually fixed variable, right? The clock was set to ring at a certain loudness. Okay, so the loudness is actually a fixed variable. She recorded the loudness of the clock with a sound sensor placed at a fixed distance. She repeated the experiment using materials Q and R of the same thickness as material P. So you can see here, material Q and R is of the same thickness. Again, this is a fixed variable. So now let's use the 5-step thinking process that that we have gone through just now. Number 1, identify the aim of the experiment. To find out the type of material that affects the loudness of the sound. Okay, so there's the aim of the experiment. To find out if the type of material, so there are 3 types of material here, P, Q, and R. Number 2, identify the constant variable and the change variable. So you can see here the change variable is a type of material. Okay, and the dependent variable is the loudness of the sound detected by the sound sensor. Right? And the change constant variable, everything else must remain the same. Distance between the sound sensor and the box. So the distance must be fixed. If not, it will not be a fair test. The loudness of the sound given out by the clock. Okay, the loudness of the sound must also be fixed. The thickness of the material is also the same. Remember this, so thickness is not the change variable, it is the fixed variable. Okay, next, step number 3, identify or analyze the results. So let's analyze the result here given in the table. So material P, you can see here, the loudness of the sound. So that means the sound sensor is able to detect the highest unit of sound or the highest loudness of sound when material P was used. So material P allows both sound to pass through, while material Q allows the least sound to pass through. Okay. Now step number 4, identify the key science concept. Right, we learn sound under the topic of energy, P6 topic of energy. So there are different types of energy. Okay, we learn about the transfer of energy. All right, we learn about heat energy, sound energy, okay, chemical potential energy, kinetic energy, different kinds of energy. Yeah. So in this instance, it is sound energy. Okay, sound energy travels and can pass through different materials. Next, step number 5, explain the link between the key science concepts to the question. So material Q is best at reducing the amount of sound energy passing through it. So you can see here material Q, the least amount of sound that passes through it. So if you want, let's say you want to, use you want your room or your bedroom to be soundproof, or you do not want the cars outside to to produce sound to enter your room. So probably you use material curtains, material made from material Q, right? Because the loudness of sound that is being detected is the least. So least amount of sound energy can pass through it. Okay. All right. Okay, very good. So I'm done here with my presentation. So I repeat again. So in this webinar, right, I'm sharing with you how to answer experiment type question. Okay, so we have identified the various kind of experiment type question. So you can see here various kind, right? This experiment type question, another PSLE past PSLE question, experiment type question. Okay, so when you see experiment question, you need to use this 5-step thinking process. Identify the aim, identify the constant variable and the change variable, identify and analyze the result, identify the key science concepts, and step number 5, explain the link between the key science concepts to the question. Okay? All right? Okay, very good. So we are done here for this session. Okay, I hope that you are quite clear. Okay? you are quite clear how to, number one, you must be able to identify what is experiment question. In the last lesson, we learned about application question. This time around, we learn about experiment type question. Now, experiment type question, it can come up both in MCQ as well as in the open-ended question. So once you're able to identify, then use the 5-step thinking process, right? That I've taught you just now. Okay, I hope you have copied down just now. Okay, the 5-step thinking process, and then you should be able to be on your way to score in the experiment type question.